what I thought I would do today is, for those of you who haven't joined us before, we have a few people who were on the waiting list for the seminar and now are in, and also for those who are joining online or who watch this when it's archived online. I thought I would quickly go over some of the key themes in the book, and then some of the key themes in the 2 chapters and 2 interludes, which we read for today. The book is made up of substantial chapters, but it also includes short interludes, which typically focus on a particular book, a novel, or a cultural text. In this case that we're speaking about today, a novel, Moby Dick, and a play, The Merchant of Venice. This is the table of contents of the book as a whole. I won't leave it up here long. If you're interested, you can go and find it on the internet. The website is maxhaiven.com/revengecapitalism, all one word. And you can see the table of contents and a chapter summary there. Just to highlight what we're going to be looking at in today's presentation and seminar. The first is the interlude, Shylock's Vindication, or Venice's Bonds. Then the chapter, The Work of Art in an Age of Unpayable Debts, Social Reproduction, Geopolitics, and Settler Colonialism. Then another interlude called Ahab's Coin, or Moby Dick's Currencies. And then the third chapter of the book, Money as a Medium of Vengeance, Colonial Accumulation, and Proletarian Practices. So just to review some of the key themes in the book, I thought I would do it with some of the passages that actually come from the conclusion of the book, where I think maybe at the end of writing the book, I was more clear about my ambitions and desires of the book than I was at the beginning, which is one of those occupational hazards for a writer. So I kind of came up with a 4-part schema. So in the first, I wish to account for the seemingly irrational and vindictive patterns of capitalist accumulation today, which are destroying life support systems of the planet, immiserating and indebting most of us, surplusing an ever increasing number of humans, and unleashing the specters of political revenge, war, fascism, fundamentalism, and economic sadism. And I think we unfortunately have all been given a front row seat to precisely what this looks like in the ongoing pandemic, where the world, as it is orchestrated by a global capitalist apparatus, though that global capitalist apparatus has many different factions, sometimes they're factions of different elements of capital, sometimes they're different nation states. That whole apparatus in general is essentially leaving many, many, many people to die, and is actively toying in many places with sacrificing a huge number of humans and non-humans alike on the altar of the economy. This is, in general, what I try and describe in this book as revenge capitalism, a capitalism that appears, and we talked a little bit last week about why I say appears to be taking a needless, warrantless, and ultimately self-defeating vengeance on the very things that give it life and energy, which is to say humans and their capacity to labor and cooperate. The second general point is that I have argued that revenge is not only, as we have been led to believe, a timeless human frailty, but it is also, and more importantly, something that is defined differently and for particular ideological purposes in each historical and cultural context. So let me just break that down for a moment. I am interested in the sort of timelessness of revenge and the way we hear about revenge and taking important lessons about revenge from the philosophies and religions of the world. But my suggestion in this book is that, in fact, we need to look at revenge as not only something that has particular historical manifestations specific to certain socioeconomic times and places, but also our idea of what is revenge, and if revenge is good or bad, or what kinds of revenge are good or bad. That is also shaped by the socioeconomic and historical circumstances under which we find ourselves, no less so in our present moment, where I'm suggesting this system of global capitalism under which we live has actually shaped what we consider to be revenge, and if we consider revenge to be good or bad, and what kinds of revenge we consider to be actually vengeful and good or bad. Okay, if that's the case, as I've said, then there's something very important at stake in how we define revenge. There's an important struggle over the meaning of revenge. And my effort in the pages of this book is to face the overwhelming sentimentality and opprobrium that has been attached to liberal capitalism's preferred myths of revenge, and instead to suggest that revenge can be used to describe the operation of interlocking systems of oppression and exploitation, specifically capitalism. I'm interested in this book not about necessarily exclusively revenge that takes place within capitalism. I'm interested in how a system, not a person, but a system, begins to or continues to take revenge, and what systemic vengeance looks like, and what it might mean then also for us to avenge ourselves upon capitalism, to end it, to annihilate it, to abolish it. So against the idea that revenge is a timeless monster of human nature that has been banished by the knights of reason to the political hinterland, to rogue states, to the ganglands, to prisons, or to slums in the kind of racist imaginary of those in power. Instead of that, I've sought to argue that revenge is at work at the very heart of this allegedly hyper-rational system. And as we discussed last week and we'll discuss in the future, for me, financialization is a central part of this. Financialization being the way that the global economy and much of society is increasingly in thrall to financialized wealth, to speculation. In this moment, we have an economy run by a million acts of incredibly brilliant, sophisticated, and well-calculated risk management. That's what finance is all about. And yet the sum effect of all of those acts of risk management, of all of that rationality, is a kind of irrational, vengeful system that is annihilating its own capacity to reproduce itself by annihilating our capacities to reproduce ourselves as its subjects. Okay, the third point of the book in general. In accounting for capitalism as a system of revenge, I hope to have contributed to efforts to bring into focus how this system's vitality and longevity is in no small part due to the way it operates both at the level of brutal economic reason, but also through fantasy, through affect, and through sociality. In the foregoing chapters of the book, and again, this part is from the conclusion, I hope to have offered a demonstration of these contradictory and non-linear relationships. In other words, it's very tempting for us as analysts of capitalism, as critics of capitalism, to become infatuated in some way with its incredible diabolical clockwork. We can assume that capitalism works perfectly, that all of the pieces fit together. That's not the case on a certain level. It is, in fact, a system constantly in crisis, a system thrown into crisis by our resistance to it. And as a result, we need to pay attention not simply to how it's this kind of its own self-preferred myths as this system of rational calculation, but actually as a system that somehow operates irrationally in its whole, and also depends upon not simply the calculus of rational homo economicus, economic man, which it insists, and its ideologues insist, is the preferred or normalized subject of capitalism. Capitalism is not just generated by that. It also includes and depends upon these non-rational or allegedly non-rational forms of behavior and interpersonal commerce, including fantasy, affect, and the sort of social fabric that it transforms. I'm trying here in this book, like many people who've gone before me and done this much better than I can, to account for the way that culture, this thing we call culture, is not separate from this thing we call the economy, and is not separate from this thing we call politics. They're all deeply connected in this capitalist system, and indeed in any system. Fourth point, throughout this book, I have also attempted to map the ways that capitalism has been fundamentally and inexorably entangled with racism, with heterosexism, with patriarchy, with colonialism, with imperialism, and with ableism, and that these systems interlock and reinforce one another, and that part of this interlocking and reinforcement operates at the level of vengefulness and revenge. Throughout the book, I look at the way these different systems of power work by lending and borrowing to and from one another, different logics of retribution, of debt, and of revenge. There were many questions last week, especially in our seminar, about the distinction I draw in this book between revenge and avenging. And in the conclusion of the book, which I'm reading from now, I try and make a distinction between, on the one hand, revenge fantasy, and on the other an avenging imaginary. And this is the sort of potted summary that I offer at one point in the conclusion. As I've argued throughout this book, whereas revenge envisions the revisiting of a harm or a debt on its author in the same or a similar form in which that debt was issued. By contrast to that, avenging strives to abolish the order or the economy of power that licensed, that authorized, or that enabled that violence in the first place. An avenging imaginary is not satisfied to turn the tables, it seeks to overturn them. An avenging imaginary does not simply dream of redistributing the winners and the losers, the debtors and the creditors, the oppressors and the oppressed, but it yearns to abolish the very foundations of the moral, political, and economic order on which those injustices are erected. In the most basic terms, an avenging imaginary dreams of revenge against a system, not only against that system's agents and beneficiaries. Whereas revenge fantasies are often fixated on others who come to stand in for systems. An avenging imaginary is informed by a complex understanding of the way individuals are made to, or sometimes choose to, become replaceable operatives within such systems. Whereas revenge fantasy speaks to an isolated fixation, an avenging imaginary emerges from and helps to reproduce sustained collective action. I'm not going to explain all of this in detail today, and indeed, I must confess, I don't explain all of it in detail in the book, and that is on purpose. This is ultimately not a book so much about giving us a playbook for revolution or for activism. I'm in other work that I've done, I've thought much more critically and engaged much more systematically with social movements. I've been I've been greatly inspired by the example of commons and commoning, and I've also written about some of the limits and possibilities for social movements. But this book is a bit different. I'm trying to turn our attention at about a 90-degree angle about how we imagine and think about capitalism. And though the final conclusion of the book and many of the pieces within the book talk about this move away from a revenge capitalism towards an avenging imaginary, it's not my primary goal. And so I beg the indulgence of the reader that at some points it can feel like this book is moving towards something that then is maybe snatched away at the last moment. My gambit is that there's something valuable enough in thinking through revenge, in thinking through avenging on a theoretical level, that it's important work for us to do, even if it doesn't necessarily lead directly or immediately to a kind of playbook for resistance. Resistance is the most important thing, but in order to resist well and to resist successfully and to resist in a way that overcomes or overturns or abolishes capitalism and its affiliated systems of power, I think we need to work to really push and stretch our imaginations. And that's what this book is about. Now, the one thing I do want to mention and pull out from this quotation here is that a major thing that I've been struggling with in this book and other books is the way that this form of capitalism that we're living through now is not just satisfied to exploit and extract the time and the resources of people and community. Other moments and other modes of capitalism have simply been interested in taking as much as they can from people's bodies and ruining their time and their society to make as much wealth as possible. That still remains the case. However, the incredibly dangerous and adaptive thing about the system of capitalism we're living under right now is that it can make any of us into its operatives, and it can make any of us completely replaceable at any time. And I think this is especially important to think about when we think about the politics of revenge, because as I try and indicate in this sentence, there's a sense that we would love to take revenge. We should love or wish to take revenge upon people who have purposefully and knowingly destroyed the planet, who have put on the altar of profit the health and well-being of whole populations, who have knowingly and purposefully continued to turn the wheels of racism, of patriarchy. These people are worthy of a kind of revenge. And yet, if some sort of individualist kind of revenge was taken and these people were killed or put in jail or whatever, that would not actually transform the system, because there are almost infinite number of other people who are willing to take their place. So the revolutionary moment, this avenging that I'm trying to imagine and that I would like you to imagine with me, is one that doesn't just satisfy itself with individual acts of revenge. It's one that would be interested in what it would mean to take revenge on a whole system, to overturn the conditions within which some people were empowered to commit such great crimes, to take from them not simply their life, but their ability to commit those heinous atrocities. So this is, in general, a summary of some of the key themes in the book and some of the ones that we discussed in the seminar last week, and we will continue to discuss in the next 2 weeks after this as well. Let's go over some of the themes in the chapters for this week. The first thing that we're going to read for this week is a brief interlude I wrote about The Merchant of Venice, one of my favorite Shakespeare plays, a truly brilliant play, one that claims in even its title to be a comedy, but I think it's much more interesting if we read it as a tragedy in certain ways, or if we read it as, if not a history, then a historical allegory. And I simply wanted to read one of the last passages of the chapter I've read here, which I think gives you a sense of what I'm trying to do with revenge, focused particularly on the vengeful figure of Shylock. Now, Shylock, as you'll know, if you've read Merchant of Venice or you've heard about it, is an anti-Semitic stereotype that Shakespeare mobilizes in order to tell essentially a cautionary tale, explicitly an anti-Semitic cautionary tale about Jewish moneylenders, that was suffused with all of the kind of populist racism of Elizabethan London. But underneath that, there's a cautionary tale about society at large. And here's the interpretation that I provide. And just to give you a sense, Merchant of Venice, of course, takes place in Venice. The main plot is that Antonio, in order to finance the courtship of his best friend, and some argue his lover, Bassanio, who's trying to woo a wealthy heiress, he borrows money from Shylock, the wealthy Jewish moneylender, and they sort of joke about it because Antonio has, up to this point, sort of harassed and belittled and, in fact, attacked Shylock for anti-Semitic reasons for years. They agree that if Antonio doesn't pay back his debt to Shylock, then Shylock will be entitled to take a pound of flesh from Antonio. Antonio is a investor in colonial ventures. His ships fail to come in from the colonies. They appear to be destroyed by a storm. And rather than sort of laugh this off or even accept payment from Antonio's friends, Shylock says, no, I'll have my bond. I want the pound of flesh. He wants revenge, not the debt. And there's a final sort of court scene where Shylock attempts to take the pound of flesh, but then Bassanio's bride, the heiress Portia, dresses up as a lawyer and then outsmarts or outwits Shylock, and he is eventually consigned to become a Christian and to forfeit all of his wealth. Okay, so here's the passage from the chapter. But if Shylock is a figure of vengefulness, of the untrustworthy, internalized outsider, who is the victim of an unspoken but chronic vengeance of Antonio and his gang, then he is also in a strange way a figure of something I will theorize as avenging, the kind of transformative power of collective liberation that aims to collect a moral debt that not only goes unpaid within the dominant order, but which can actually not be repaid within that order. Shylock is offered money that Antonio owes him many times over, more than enough to make him one of the richest men in Venice. He wants not the money, he wants his bond. He wants the flesh. He doesn't want justice that will balance the Duke's scales, the Duke of Venice in this case, but one that will obliterate the oppressor, Antonio. Shylock as a character is odious, petty, vain, self-centered, obsessive, and pettily vindictive. Shylock as a revolutionary figure is glorious. There isn't enough money in Venice to satisfy the debts that are owed to him. After all, the wealth of Venice depended on him and the other Jews acting as moneylenders, merchants, and intermediaries. They made Venice rich, and he, Shylock, through I lost my place. Through Venice's own laws, will bring it down, forcing the Duke to accede to the brutal murder of his favorite son of the city, right in his own court. The scales will not be balanced for Shylock. They were never balanced to begin with. They were always tipped in favor of the dominators. The scales will be destroyed. If you want to read more, you can, of course, pick up the book. Fascinating play. I'm very glad I got to write about it. The next chapter we read is an extended one, and it's called The Work of Art in an Age of Unpayable Debts, Social Reproduction, Geopolitics, and Settler Colonialism. In it, I try and contrast two types of unpayable debts, which I say are at work in our global moment. And I try and theorize debt as a form of revenge, and try and theorize revenge as a form of debt. I won't go into the coat of weeds of the background of theory around it. You, of course, are welcome to if you wish. But I will just point out the three examples that I look at, because I think they're all quite revealing. What's pictured here is a performance in 2017 by Marta Minuchin, the Argentinian pop artist. And you can see that she's seated back to back in this art museum in Athens at the Documenta 14 festival. This is the launch event of Documenta 14, which took place this year in both Kassel, Germany, and Athens, Greece. She's seated back to back here with Angela Merkel impersonator. Angela Merkel, of course, being the famous German chancellor. And in this performance, essentially, which was called The Repayment of the Greek Debt to Europe with Olives and Art, it was a kind of strange, poorly orchestrated ritual where Angela Merkel, shortly after this photograph was taken, sort of stood up and made a big speech about how the debt that had been destroying the Greek economy and Greek society for almost a decade at this point, since the 2008 financial crisis, was null and void, because in fact Europe, to whom most of that debt was owed, and especially Germany, to whom most of that debt was owed, actually owed a deeper, more profound debt to Greece as the kind of cradle of European civilization. And then at that point, Minuchin, for some reason, then took a handful of the olives, which you see in the kind of tank that they're sitting in front of, and offered it to Merkel as a kind of exchange. So that the sort of the forgiving or the destruction of the debt. I'm extremely critical of this piece for reasons that you can read about if you're interested. I think it was poorly conceived, poorly judged, and poorly informed. I think it was, to a certain extent, characterized a lot of what many Greek critics have charged against the Documenta Festival, that in some ways, the appearance of this incredibly expensive German art festival in Athens in a moment of crisis was mistimed, misjudged, and largely served German and so-called Northern European art elites rather than the actual local art scene. I think more generally, though it brings up the question of whether a financial debt should outweigh a cultural debt, it makes a number of kind of critical blunders. But one thing that I think it is useful for thinking about is how art can think through these kind of debts which are unpayable. Obviously, as Minuchin makes clear, the debt that Europe, so-called, owes Greece, so-called, is unpayable. It's this massive intergenerational debt. However, the debt that Germany, especially on German banks and Northern European banks more generally, have imposed on Greece is also in some ways equally unpayable. It is an unpayable debt. It's been acknowledged by the European Commission and others that it's impossible for Greece to have enough economic growth to actually pay back this debt in the first place. It's a ruinous and odious debt. So essentially, there's a play in this art piece between two types of unpayable debts. Another project I look at is this one by Darren Cullen, which is called Pocket Money Loans. He basically set up a payday loan shop for children that would offer them small, like 5 to 10 pound loans to buy toys and other such things. with it cultivated the kind of angst that we as a society have around children and money, essentially, children and finance. Here, I think Cullen is pointing to, again, two layers of unpayable debt. On the one hand, we live in a society where many poor, working class, and even middle class people are completely dependent on access to more and more exploitative forms of debt and loans in order to simply get by, in order to simply survive. And that includes many families who have children. At the same time, they're playing, I think, with a notion of unpayable debt in between generations, which I think we recognize as undeniable, that we owe those who've come before us something and that we will be owed something. Whether we should talk about that as debt, whether we should talk about that as intergenerational bonds is an interesting question. But I think ultimately it gives us food for thought about what unpayable debts matter and which don't. Sorry about the noise here. I think our neighbors are drilling something. I think recreationally, they do this every once in a while. Maybe they just don't like the book. I don't know. Everyone's a critic these days. The third piece that I look at is by the Anishinaabe artist Rebecca Belmore. This was performed, I believe, in 2009 at the Nuit Blanche Festival in Toronto, in front of the headquarters of Canada's largest and wealthiest bank. It was a sort of performance ritual that involved Canadian pennies, and I analyze it as a method for thinking through the sorry, the drilling is very distracting. A way of thinking through, on the one hand, the way that finance and money has been used as a constant tool of settler colonialism within the Canadian capitalist context, and at the same time, a way of bringing a kind of haunting presence back to the center of Canada's financial district of an unpayable debt for the crimes and cruelties of that settler colonialism as well. So this is the chapter on debt. Then there's another interlude called Ahab's Coin or Moby Dick's Currencies. I hope many of you are also fans of Herman Melville's phenomenal 19th century novel, Moby Dick. I analyze Moby Dick from a number of different perspectives, leaning heavily on the incredible analysis of it by the great Caribbean philosopher C.L.R. James. And I end that chapter by trying to think through a very curious question, which comes up a number of times in the book, which is, as James Baldwin puts it, is revenge a human dream? Which is to say, do animals take revenge? We know that animals can react. We know that they can take, when they're hurt, they can act violently, but is revenge and this idea of premeditating revenge, what one of the participants in last week's seminar called the temporality of revenge, this suspension, or what I call later in the book, Hamlet's interregnum, between the call to take revenge and the actual taking of revenge. Is that a particular human quality? And what do then we gain from all of these depictions of the so-called revenge of nature, which I think in some ways is one of its most powerful articulations, is Moby Dick, this incredible story of the revenge of the white whale on the whaling fleet of Nantucket, but also a tale of revenge of one of the captains, Captain Ahab of the Pequot ship, on or against the whale who has, taken his leg famously, and et cetera, et cetera. And so in the end, I come to the conclusion that our fantasies about the revenge of nature ultimately don't serve us very well. And I think this is especially important in the moment when many commentators have been suggesting that the COVID-19 pandemic in some way has been triggered by our destruction of the Earth's ecosystems and biodiversity. I'm not disputing that. I think that's very true, but it's often been framed for largely poetic or rhetorical reasons as the revenge of nature. And I have a hunch that that doesn't actually serve us very well. And this is why. I'll read you this little passage. As tempting as it is to cast our lot with Moby Dick, the avenger of his species, and delight in the recompense for all our all too human accumulative sadism, this is a fantasy, a projection, and not simply because Moby Dick is a novel that is truly, it is true, based on real events. Our fantasy of the revenge of nature is a fantasy precisely because, like the whole genre of revenge of nature films, it performs a double movement that obfuscates and ultimately reinforces the system of capitalist ecocide it would appear to critique. Why? On the one hand, as mentioned, it reifies, or to put it in simpler terms, it makes real and celebrates human agency, mastery, and exceptionalism by projecting it onto the non-human animal. So there's a kind of narcissism here. The Moby Dick isn't a whale. It's a fictional whale that is in fact a sort of a carrier or a symbol for humanity and for human capacities. So there's a kind of human or anthropocentric narcissism here. At the same time, it exonerates humanity as a whole. It lets us off the hook from actually taking responsibility for the abolition of the ecocidal systems we have created. The mythology of the Revenge of Nature films and of this book in some ways, or one reading of the book, is that nature will take care of itself. We are helpless in the face of Moby Dick's revenge, which is actually our own revenge on ourselves for what we have done to him and his kind. So finally, in the last chapter that that we're speaking about today, I talk a little bit about money and a different way of thinking about money. So very briefly, for most liberal and neoliberal philosophers, money has been presented in their work as a technology of peace. And the story goes something like this. Once upon a time, humans were at war with each other constantly, and we have this kind of like primitivist caveman view of human nature where it was competition over scarce resources. And as a result, humans were not able to cooperate and build complex advanced societies. And then along came a sovereign, along came a warlord, along came a ruler, and basically said, stop taking revenge on each other. I'm going to force you to stop taking revenge on each other. And instead, if you need to take revenge, if someone harms you, come to me and I will take revenge on them for you, for I am the law. This is the kind of mythology of the kind of patriarchal, Eurocentric vision of global history. But of course, the problem is that no individual can be trusted to have this role as the sovereign, the ruler, because ultimately any human is going to have their own particular interests and they're going to use their power in order to implement them. So on a very basic level, if they commit a crime, they're going to not punish themselves for it. If their friend commits a crime or their supporter commits a crime, they're not going to punish them, etc., etc. Okay, along comes money. Money evolves naturally, according to this mythology, from the way the humans trade with one another, from the way they truck and barter. This is stuff you can take from Adam Smith and very brilliant theories of it, John Locke. Their natural propensity for humans to truck and barter then allows one commodity to emerge from all of the commodities, a commodity called money. It can take many different forms: gold coins, beads, salt has been used as money. And money allows people to develop much more complex societies, according to this mythology. It allows people to specialize so that each individual is not all producing clothes and food and shoes and etc. But each individual can specialize in producing one of those things and trade their goods with one another. And money makes that a lot easier. What has happened, however, and you can read this in the sort of neoliberal philosophies of someone like Niall Ferguson, is the argument of the sort of neoliberals is that, well, at a certain point, money under capitalism transcends the sovereign. So it takes on the function of the ruler. So rather than having an interested ruler who uses their power to kind of monopolize society, if you trust society to money and markets, then it will become essentially a technology of peace. The most brilliant articulation of this is in someone like Hayek, but you can also see it in Milton Friedman. The neoliberal philosophers truly believed that if you allowed money to ascend to a level where it rules society, things will be much fairer, and you will finally overcome the kind of atavistic vengefulness that is the human inheritance. This would be, as Francis Fukuyama would put it in the early 90s, the end of history. the end of this kind of cycle of retribution and the struggle for recognition that had characterized sort of Hegelian notions of history. Okay, that's the story. And for many of us, that's the story we've been taught, whether we know it or not. I, in this chapter, want to tell a different story. And it's a story that has sort of 4 parts. The first part is about purple and white beads called wampum. These were shells, made of shells that were cultivated around what's now Connecticut and Long Island in the United States, and were used before colonization by many different indigenous nations for a whole variety of purposes. You can see some of the uses and the manufacturing techniques from pre-colonial era here on the screen. They used these type as a trade commodity, yes, but they also used it for funerary and marriage rites. They were used to pay ransoms. They were used for all sorts of religious and secular religious ceremonies, but also secular regalia. A huge number of uses for these very rare and special beads. When the Europeans arrived, there was a particular incident in 1720 with a Dutch trader named Van Elkens, who essentially kidnapped the leader of the Pequod, whose name you might remember from the name of the ship in Moby Dick. Interesting parallel there, which is discussed in the book in more detail. He essentially held this leader named Tabotem at ransom for beaver pelts, which he was trying to export back to Holland. And when the Pequot people explained that they couldn't provide him with the beaver pelts because the beavers were not in season at that point, he killed Tabotem, his hostage, but not before getting basically a king's ransom of these wampum beads. And then shortly afterwards, Ellikens and his other fellow European traders began to understand that because they now controlled many of the coastal areas of what is now New England, they could monopolize the manufacture of wampum beads. And they began to demand that these beads be used as the legal tender of the colonies. As their power grew, they began to fine indigenous people in wampum beads, demanding it as payment. They began to use wampum as the main currency, so that indigenous people needed wampum in order to buy the things that they had been made dependent on, like guns, like alcohol, like tin and metal pots and other things that had come through the trading economy. And so ultimately, where wampum used to be a technology of peace, a technology that literally, as you can see on the bottom here, was a medium through which treaties were made between indigenous nations, it then became a medium of a kind of systematic vengeance of this nascent colonial capitalist system on indigenous people. It became a weapon of genocide, of econocide as well, the destruction of a whole indigenous economy. So I begin with this story as a different origin story of modern money. And there are a number of scholars who point out that in this encounter and this exploitation of the wampum economy, Europeans actually learned some very valuable lessons for themselves about how to approach money, lessons that would go into the reformulation of American money and global capitalist money in the centuries to come. I then turn a little bit and say, well, nowadays, we have a huge amount of rhetoric on our hands of people who want to talk about financial innovation. They want to take the new technology, new digital technologies that are out there and use them to transform the world. But I think that a lot of these fantasies about using money to transform society actually inherit, unfortunately, the kind of perspective of domination, of capitalism, of colonialism. And I ask the question in the latter half of this chapter, well, what if we looked at the forms of money innovation of people who've traditionally been excluded, exploited, or murdered by capitalism? What kind of financial innovation were they practicing? And I look at 3 very obscure examples, which I'll show you briefly here. If you're interested in this, you can not only read the chapter, I actually have a YouTube lecture, an illustrated YouTube lecture, which I've prepared, and I can share the link in the notes in a moment. The first one are convict love tokens. So here in London, where I am right now, prisoners who had been arrested for a whole manner of crimes, basically survival activities of the working class in London in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, were convicted and sentenced either to death or to what was called transportation, where essentially you would be sent to one of Britain's colonies, first in the Americas, later Australia, and be made into an indentured servant. So essentially you would be committed for usually a period of 7 years to a kind of temporary enslavement. And while British prisoners were awaiting their transportation, and very often they died en route to the colonies, they would often commission the carving of what's called a convict love token. And you can see one here from a one Thomas Tilley, who was convicted of counterfeiting, in fact, which at that time was a capital offense, punishable by death or transportation. And they use this as a method to offer something to give to their loved ones whom they'd be leaving behind, who they were likely never to see again. Because even if you survived your 7-year sentence of indentured servitude, your probability of being able to return to England, to be able to accumulate enough wealth to be able to buy your passage back and surviving returning back to England would be extremely unlikely. So here's a coin from Thomas Tilley, and there was a whole range of really innovative and interesting ways that working class people effaced the image of the king on the coin. And at the very crux of capitalism in the state, the coin, where on money the face of the king appears, they began to develop their own repertoire for expressing different kinds of solidarity and meaning against the kind of what Peter Linebaugh has called thanatocracy of the age, which is to say the rule of death. A second example are Hobo Nickels. These were carved between, I think, around 1914 and 1945 in the United States, largely by hobos, that is, working class Americans who were made homeless by economic crisis and forced to, so as they say, ride the rails in search of food and work. One of the ways in which hobos would maybe earn a little money is they would develop these kind of craft practices, what would be remembered by historians as craft practices, including the carving of coins. So this is the famous buffalo head nickel, or Indian head nickel, which then, and I should have showed you a sort of before picture, in the first place was a sort of a canvas for these itinerant workers and unemployed people to carve on, to carve their own portraits or to carve pictures of themselves. And so take back from the nation state, the capitalist nation state, the very medium of its expression and communion, and instead imprint their own messages on it. There's some evidence to suggest that these were used in some ways as secret coded messages, but at very least they offered a different sort of sphere of social commerce and a different way of valuing their own lives and their own artistic expression within an economic system that fundamentally devalued them and left them to die. And finally, I look at a kind of parafictional adventure. Great Freudian slip there. This has been a good one for Freudian slips. A great parafictional example from the artist duo Kahn and Selesnik, which takes place, it projects itself back to the year 1923 in the port city of Lübeck in Germany, where in their version of this story, a huge iceberg somehow miraculously floats its way down from the North Pole and gets lodged in the port of Lübeck on the Baltic Sea. And in their kind of mythology that they create about this iceberg, many of the citizens of Lübeck begin to create a kind of temporary autonomous zone on the iceberg, which they call the Iceberg Free State or Iceberg Freistaat. And the idea is ultimately that at this moment in Germany, as many of you will recall, Germany was being forced to pay ruinous reparations to the Allied powers after the First World War, which would eventually lead to the kind of economic degradation that would see the rise of Nazism and eventually the horrors of the Second World War as well. But in this moment between 1921 and 1923, there was such a huge inflation of the German mark, Reichsmarks, that essentially cities and municipalities began to print their own money. As you can see, this mark that's pictured here for the Iceberg Freistaat is for 500 billion marks. So because the economy was in such dire straits and inflation kept on going up and up and up every day, the city would have to manufacture essentially every week a higher denomination of bill just to keep commerce going. And so in this art piece, which is sort of retrospective and archival, but also, as I say, parafictional, it's unclear how much of it is real and how much of it is imagined. Kahn and Selesnik, who did this piece, I think in 2007, 2008, very close to our own great economic meltdown, began to create a whole variety of materials to reflect on this temporary autonomous zone that might have been created on this iceberg. And so at the end of this chapter on money as a form of revenge, I ruminate on these three examples: the convict love token, the hobo nickel, and the what's called Notgeld, or emergency money, of the Iceberg Freistaat. And I try and think about, well, what does then this teach us about the way in which working people, people who have never had any power over the economy and yet are subject to that economy, what do they make of financial innovation? What do we make of financial innovation? And rather than trying to think up new schemes for, God knows, cryptocurrencies or new forms of economic management, maybe we should return to the kinds of quotidian proletarian creativity and resistance and revenge against money that is emblematized in these examples. So I seem to have talked for a little longer than I intended. I do want to close this open session by just going over some of the very interesting questions that have been posed by participants in the seminar, just to let you kind of have a window on, for those of you who are just joining us for the broadcast, on what kind of things we're talking about. And we will look forward to seeing you again soon. For those who are in the seminar, stick around, because in a moment we're going to have a discussion. But let me just go through a couple of the early questions just as we close this part of it. So here's one question that comes from our participants. Would it be reasonable to suggest that one difference between revenge and avenging is that revenge exists within and maintains the existing dominant order, even if revenge is exacted by the hands of the oppressed? Well, avenging is an action by which its process subverts or transforms the existing order, and that's what defines it as revolutionary. I think that's very true. I think that's a very good summary of one of the aspects of avenging. Although I wrote the book in order precisely to generate questions like this, rather than to be able to necessarily provide answers. But I think this is a very nice reframing and encapsulation of some of these themes. Yes. Another question is, I wonder how the examples in chapter 3 could be used, and so this chapter 3 was the one about different forms of money, could be used to avenge reactionary discourses that developed at the outset of the COVID-19 quarantining on Turtle Island, which is the indigenous name, the Anishinaabe name to be precise, for North America and beyond. Specifically, that the mutual aid political economy and informal non-capitalist production and distribution networks that sprung up in response to the pandemic were quote unquote primitive or overly simple, and thus at best only a temporary staving off of the inevitable return to financialized neoliberal capitalism. And this is a very perceptive question, and I absolutely agree. And I think we can expect to see more of this in the coming months, that the kinds of mutual aid and the alternative economies that we have been able to create in this moment of pandemic will be slandered, will be defamed, and will be mocked by those in power as just simple-minded, automatic stuff. Whereas in fact, I think what is open to us is to realize that the kinds of mutual aid and the kinds of economies we're forming to support one another in this moment are actually what should be the bedrock of the economy to come, rather than simply a return to the financialized neoliberalism that got us into this mess in the first place. And I'll just give a final example from the questions from this week. In discussing unpayable debts in chapter 2, you identify the radical potential of claiming unpayable debts from below as involving, quote, turning of the tables on the powerful to insist that the oppressed and the exploited are owed a debt that, importantly, cannot be repaid in the currency, value paradigm, or legal apparatus of the powerful, unquote. Do you see any radical potentials nested in the dynamics of oppression and resistance bound up with unpayable debts from above? I think I understand this question to be saying, is there a potential in refusing to repay debts from above that are imposed? And I think the answer is absolutely yes. I think that we've already seen incredible organizing all around the world to reject repayment of debt. In the United States right now, there's an incredible organization called Debt Collective, which is trying to organize a massive debt strike. I definitely recommend checking them out. We've also seen efforts throughout the so-called third world to band together a variety of different countries to refuse to pay back debt. Famously, Thomas Sankara, who was essentially assassinated by European powers and sort of Western imperialist powers for trying to do precisely this. We've seen many movements around the world against debt, and in fact, you might be if you take the many examples provided by David Graeber in his phenomenal book, Debt, the First 5,000 Years, I think it's undeniable that resisting or rejecting debt has been at the core of many of the most revolutionary social movements around the world. Now, the one thing I'll say to close is that often this movement to reject debt doesn't espouse itself in a particularly revolutionary language to begin with. To begin with, sometimes it takes around a language of, I agree I should pay back some of the debt, but not all of the debt. Or I agree that those people should pay back debt, but not me because I was swindled into this debt, etc. I think the much more radical thing is to take those movements for partial debt resistance and refusal and try and network them together for a more mass refusal of paying back debts. But of course, the risk is always, and this is something that Cassie, who's facilitating today, has addressed in her artwork about debt, is that, the fantasy of eliminating debt can also be a double-edged sword, because if we simply demand that we want debt to be abolished tomorrow, then actually in certain ways it will make capitalism function better than it's ever functioned, because essentially now we all have more expendable and disposable income to be consumers. So when we refuse debt, it's also about, as the group Strike Debt sort of discussed in their Debt Resisters Operations Manual, or that Andrew Ross has talked about in his phenomenal book, Creditocracy. As we talk about rejecting and refusing debts from above, we also need to, I think, articulate a different language of social bonds, of interreliance and interdependency, of sort of debts from below that exist between and among us who aren't, debt capitalists, as a way to kind of bring forward a different vision of a society that's not simply just competitive Homo economicus, now debt-free, but instead a very different kind of political animal.